Hello and welcome to chilly Lofoten in winter. So one of the questions I get asked a lot in comments and in emails is, what are the best settings? What's the best way to set your camera up for shooting landscape photography? Now, for a long time I've kind of avoided answering this question or really going into detail about it, because I think that the settings that you use are quite personal. It really depends on the way that you shoot and it's different for everybody. But I do think that there are certain settings, certain ways that you can set your camera up that are always going to be conducive to getting better landscape images. And so in this video, what I want to do is have a look at how you can do that. Now, the settings that you have your camera set up for when you're shooting landscape images, what you want is to find the balance between having the camera as intuitive as possible, so you don't have to be delving around into the menus, into the settings when the light's at its best, so that the camera is responding very easily and intuitively to the adjustments that you make to control it, so you can really focus on getting the exposure exactly how you like it and composing. But at the same time, what you don't want to have is the camera set up with too many automated functions, because when the camera has auto settings, what's happening then is the camera is making decisions and not you. And when you're shooting landscape photographs, when you're shooting landscape images, it's all about your vision, capturing it how you want to, capturing the mood in the way that it appears to you. So you don't want the camera to be making decisions about things like contrast, about things like exposure or anything like that. You should have as much in your hands as possible. So it's finding that balance between intuitive control. And also, the other thing is that you want to be recording your images in the maximum, with the maximum possible quality, so that you come away from the scene with as much data as possible. So when you go to process and edit the photographs in Lightroom, you've got as much data from the scene as possible, in the shadows, in the highlights, with the cleanest image files that you can possibly have. So the first and the most important thing is that you shoot your images in RAW format and not in JPEG. When you shoot in JPEG, what's happening is the camera is choosing the amount of saturation, the amount of contrast, the amount of sharpening on each image. It's choosing how green the greens are, how dark the shadows are, and taking away that control from you. And then when the image is recorded in JPEG, that's locked and baked into the file. So editing it and processing it and changing it later on becomes really, really hard. Whereas if you shoot the image in RAW, the camera is recording as much color and tonal detail as is in the scene without applying contrast or saturation or sharpening. It also leaves you free later on to adjust the white balance. You can move that. It doesn't need to be set in camera. So if you shoot in RAW, it's going to give you image files with the most data possible for you to be able to process and get the best out of your images later on. If you shoot in JPEG, that's going to be baked in, and any adjustments that you do are going to degrade the image file. So the next thing is the exposure controls, the so-called exposure triangle of shutter speed, aperture and ISO, or ISO if you prefer. The three settings which control how light enters the camera. Now, the first thing is that you want to be trying to shoot with the best possible quality. So you should have the camera set at its base ISO. Now that differs on different cameras, but the base ISO is the ISO where the camera is operating at its most efficient level. So it's where its light gathering capabilities are at their best, which gives you the least amount of noise in an image. It gives you the best dynamic range in an image. So you've got the biggest range between the shadows and the highlights, with less chance of clipping either. And the base ISO is almost always marked on your camera, but it's not to be mistaken with the lowest ISO, because on many cameras, like the Fuji that I'm using now, it has a low ISO, and what that actually is the base ISO that's then enhanced to, in Fuji they just basically overexpose the base ISO by one stop. And when you shoot with those settings like that, it gives you a higher possibility, for example, of overexposing the image. So you should always try to have the ISO at its base. If the camera's on a tripod, the setting that you have to worry about least is the shutter speed, because the camera's fixed in place, so you can shoot with shutter speeds of 2 minutes, or you can shoot with shutter speeds of half a second and not have to worry about shake. So you don't have to get light into the camera as fast as possible. So for the most time, when you're shooting landscape images and the camera's on a tripod, have the camera at its base ISO. Likewise with aperture, there's the whole aperture range of the lens, but what you find is most lenses perform best. They're at their sharpest somewhere in the middle of the aperture range. It differs between different lenses, but something like f7.1, f8, f9 is where your lens is going to perform at its best. If you open the lens all the way up to its widest aperture, f4, f2.8, you're often going to find that the images get a little bit softer in the borders or in the corners. If you go all the way to the other end of the aperture range to something like f22, the aperture is really shrinking down, so the light's coming through a tiny pinhole, and the images start to suffer from things like diffraction. Anything really above f13, you're going to start to move into this territory. And diffraction is going to make the images softer, you're going to lose detail. So you should keep the aperture around about f8 as much as possible, which means the variable that changes the most is the shutter speed. And if the camera, as I said, is on a tripod, that doesn't matter quite so much. If you're shooting handheld, then it's a little bit different. Then you get into the whole area of what shutter speed can you shoot at without getting camera shake, and that really depends on the focal length that you're using, because shake is magnified along longer focal lengths, and also whether you're using image stabilization and things like that. A general rule is that the shutter speed should be double your focal length. So if you're shooting at 15 millimeters, then you should be shooting at about 1/30. If you're shooting at 100 millimeters, you should be shooting at about 1/200. But image stabilization usually gives you 3 or 4 or 5 stops more than that, so you can shoot faster. It really varies. So when you are shooting handheld and you have to adjust the shutter speed and you're worried about camera shake, then probably the next setting that I would normally change would be opening the aperture a little bit wider. But then you have to worry about depth of field. If you're shooting wide angle, then depth of field becomes a much bigger problem, because you're probably going to have a foreground that's closer to you. But if you're shooting at a wide focal length, something like 15, then you can shoot much faster handheld anyway, so you probably don't have to worry about changing the aperture. The ISO, you should only really change it in extreme conditions. If you're shooting in low light, if you're shooting Astro, or if you're shooting Aurora, then you're going to have to bump up the ISO, because you need to get as much light as fast as possible into the lens. But if you're shooting just a regular long exposure in the blue hour, keep the ISO on the base, get the camera on a tripod, and just extend the shutter time. If you're shooting with manual exposure, then you don't really need to worry about how the camera is metering the scene. I always have it set to evaluative, which takes the whole of the scene that the camera can see on the sensor and then gives you an approximate of that. But if you're shooting manual anyway and you're looking at the histogram, then it really doesn't matter what kind of evaluative system that you have the camera set up to. Now, when it comes to focusing the camera, this is different for everyone. I tend to shoot with manual focus with the camera set to focus peaking. And what focus peaking does is it finds edges of contrast and really highlights them in the viewfinder or in the LCD, so you can see that those areas that are really highlighted are in focus. And it allows me to see that the image is in focus from the foreground all the way to the background. You can shoot, focus is so good in most cameras nowadays that even shooting autofocus, you're generally going to get a sharp image that's in focus all the way through, particularly if you're focusing on something about 1/3 of the way into the image. One of the things that you have to worry about mostly with focus is depth of field. If you're shooting really, really wide, if you've got a foreground that's close to the camera, that's within 1 meter of the camera, and you have mountains in the background, the bigger the camera sensor size, so if you're shooting with a full frame sensor or if you're shooting medium format, you have less depth of field, so it's more chance that either the mountain in the background or the foreground are going to be out of focus. Focus peaking allows me to see that very quickly, very visually, what's in focus and what isn't. But if you're shooting autofocus, then you can just quite easily just drop the autofocus point on the foreground and then drop the autofocus point on the background and blend the images later on. And then some other settings in the menu system that I think you should always kind of get ready before you go out shooting are things like turning off the long exposure noise reduction. What long exposure noise reduction does is it does kind of a blank exposure after you've done your regular exposure. So let's say you've done an exposure of 10 seconds. To reduce the noise, the camera then does another 10-second blank exposure to then evaluate where the noise is. But what that means is for that 10 seconds, your camera is out of action. You can't shoot. And that really becomes important if you're shooting longer exposures of 1 minute or 30 seconds when the light is at its peak, because you lose half of the time when you could be shooting, the camera is doing long exposure noise reduction on it. So I prefer to turn that off so I can just shoot without having to worry about the camera doing that, and then reduce noise in post-production later on. Another thing that I think is important to set up in your camera before you go out shooting is the bracketing. Now, bracketing is when the camera shoots a series of images at different exposures. And different cameras have different default bracketing settings. For example, in the Fuji, the default is that it shoots one image at the base exposure. It shoots one image that's a third of a stop underexposed and one that's a third of a stop overexposed. And in modern cameras with the kind of dynamic range that you have nowadays, and also when you're shooting landscapes, a third of a stop either side really doesn't make that much of a difference overall. I think for bracketing images, you need to have a minimum of at least one stop overexposed and one stop underexposed, maybe even a stop and a half or a stop and 2/3 above and then below, because that's going to mean that when you shoot in a scene that's got a very high dynamic range, so if you're shooting into a really bright sun or if there are really strong shadows, you're going to have the underexposed image, which is going to get all of the highlight detail, and then the overexposed image is going to give you all of the shadow detail. So it's important that your bracketing settings are set quite far apart, so at least one stop overexposed and one stop underexposed. You can even do 5 images if you like, and then have one stop going up by one stop, so one stop above and 2 stops above, and one stop below and 2 stops below. I very rarely feel that I need to shoot 5 images. 3 images is usually enough, but it's an option if you ever feel that you need it. Another thing to remember is that when you're shooting in the field, even if you're shooting raw, what you're seeing in your LCD or what you're seeing through the electronic viewfinder is actually the embedded JPEG of the image. You're not seeing the raw file, and consequently any histogram that is displayed is the histogram of the JPEG and not of the raw file. Now, the raw file will always have more dynamic range than the JPEG. So when the histogram is right at the edge, what it is, it's right at the edge of the JPEG. So even if it's blinking, it might mean that you're clipping details in the JPEG that won't be clipped in the raw file. But even so, it's still a very good thing to do. Make sure you've got the histogram put up onto the LCD or onto the viewfinder, so you can always see whether the image is going to be overexposed or underexposed. Now, some people like to use the zebra stripes, which really highlight the overexposed areas. I prefer not to use them. I find them very distracting when it comes to composition, and find that I can just use the histogram. That's fine for me. But using the zebra stripes does give you a very clear idea of whether you're overexposing your images or not. Another thing that I like to do on the LCD is make sure that the display on the back of the screen has all of the exposure and focusing information turned off. I still keep it so I can see it through the viewfinder, which is where I do a lot of my composing. But I like to also have the LCD with all of that details turned off, because when I'm composing, I always like to scan the edge of the frame to see if there are things sticking into the edge of the frame that I can't see. And what you find is that there's so much information on the back of your screen now that it's sometimes hard to see whether there are branches or huts poking in at the side of the tree that you're then going to have to crop out later on. So I like to be able to see the whole frame, everything that the camera is going to record, and for that I always have the display on the LCD turned so it's totally clear and all of the information is turned off. And then the only other things are that I always make sure that I've got the camera level turned on, so that when I'm composing, the camera's showing me that the actual scene is level. And then things like in the My Menu settings, I put the settings that I most often need to change if I have to go into a menu, things that I can't put on the dials of the camera, because occasionally I might want to shoot a time lapse, so I'm going to want to go to the intervalometer, and I don't want to be having to dive through the menu to find that, so I put things like that on My Menu. Likewise, some of the video settings for shooting f-log or not, for shooting 4K or not, because that allows me to very quickly change the settings into the field and not get lost diving into the menus trying to find out where the intervalometer is. Oh, and one other thing is that if your camera does have 2 card slots, I don't shoot RAW and JPEG, I only shoot RAW. So you basically have a choice if you're going to have your RAW files fill up one card and then go into the other card, that's sequential, or whether you're going to have it mirrored where the RAW files go into both cards. I prefer to have the cards mirrored, because it always gives me a backup just in case there's any problem with one of the cards. And also I make sure that all of my video just goes to one card, so that's not across both cards. And I think that's it. I'm pretty sure there must be something that I've forgotten. So if there's a setting that you're curious about in your camera that I haven't mentioned, just drop it in the comments below or drop me an email and I'll get back to you. And if you enjoy my photography, if you enjoy the way that I shoot, I'd love to have you on a workshop next year. I'm just launching my workshops for 2023 now. You can see them on my website. We'll be going to Namibia. We'll be coming back here to Lofoten. There'll be workshops in Tuscany. There'll be workshops in Iceland. There'll be workshops in the Dolomites. So have a look on my website. There's full information there, and just just drop me a line if there's anything that you're interested in. And now I'm going to go off and do some shooting. We've got great conditions for photography today. There's not really any wind. I could do with a little bit more light, but this kind of cloud is really, really great for moody photography. So thanks for watching as always, and good luck with your photography. See ya.